The Billie Jean performance that changed everything for Jaafar Jackson. Before Jaafar Jackson ever stepped into the spotlight. As Michael Jackson, there was one question hanging over the entire project. Could he actually carry the weight of his uncle's legacy? According to the source transcript, this wasn't a simple casting decision. The production had spent 2 years searching for someone capable of bringing Michael's presence to the screen, with hundreds of people considered before the role ultimately went to Michael's nephew. Jaafar wasn't just taking on a famous character. He was stepping into the shoes of a man whose music, movement, and stage presence had become almost impossible to separate from his identity. His family was watching, the filmmakers were watching, and eventually the entire world would be watching. What made Jaafar's challenge even more complicated was his voice. According to the transcript, his natural tone was already remarkably similar to Michael's, and that similarity had reportedly created problems for him before the movie. The source says record labels had rejected Jaafar because he sounded too much like his uncle. Yet the very quality that had once seemed like a disadvantage suddenly became one of the most important tools for the biopic. Jaafar still had to train extensively, learning how to bring his voice into a higher register, and finding the pitch and tone that naturally connected it to Michael without turning the performance into a simple imitation. He spent years rehearsing until he could finally look in the mirror and believe he was ready. Then came Billie Jean. The lights came up, the music began, and according to the source, something changed in the room. For a few seconds, people weren't simply watching Michael's nephew perform one of his uncle's greatest songs. They were seeing the familiar gestures, movement, and energy associated with Michael himself. The transcript describes Jaafar Jackson watching from the audience, while people close to the family reportedly reacted with shock and emotion. Fans responded as well, with clips of the performance spreading online and shifting the conversation from whether Jaafar could imitate Michael to whether he could actually make audiences feel Michael again. But the most surprising part was still ahead. Jaafar wasn't simply standing there while Michael's original recording played over the scene. According to the source, he actually sang live into the microphone during the performances, with his vocal blended with Michael's track. And behind that apparent similarity was an enormous amount of preparation. Billie Jean would become one of the most demanding sequences because the Motown 25 performance had to be reconstructed with extraordinary precision, down to individual pauses, gestures, and tiny movements. The performance therefore became more than a tribute. It became the moment when Jaafar finally had to prove that he wasn't simply related to Michael Jackson. He had the ability to step into the performance and make the audience believe it. The 2-year preparation behind Jaafar's impossible transformation. Long before Jaafar Jackson stepped into the spotlight as Michael Jackson, he was already preparing for a challenge that had not yet become real. According to the source transcript, his transformation wasn't something that happened after he got the role. He had spent years rehearsing, studying Michael's performances, and repeatedly looking at himself in the mirror until the image began to feel believable. Jaafar described rehearsing every day and continuing for a couple of years before he finally felt ready. That preparation mattered because he wasn't simply learning songs. He was trying to understand the tiny physical details that made Michael recognizable, the way he breathed, held a microphone, moved his wrist, and transitioned from one movement into another. The voice presented another enormous challenge. According to the source, Jaafar's natural voice was already similar to Michael's, but it actually sat lower than his uncle's. Music supervisor John Warhurst explained that Jaafar had to learn how to speak in a higher register and find the pitch and tone that naturally brought his voice closer to Michael's. The important distinction was that the goal wasn't simply to force an imitation. The production team wanted Jaafar to find the natural similarity already present in his own voice and develop it through training. Warhurst reportedly described his voice as physically very similar to Michael's, but emphasized that resemblance alone wasn't enough. Jaafar still had to train for years to master the vocal qualities required for the role. Then the physical preparation became just as demanding. The source says the transformation ultimately involved 22 days of rehearsal and 30 distinct looks, with Jaafar having to step into different stages of Michael's life and career. But the most difficult challenge was waiting at the end of that preparation. The Motown 25 Billie Jean performance. Unlike other sequences where the filmmakers could allow some creative freedom, this one had to be recreated with extraordinary precision. The original footage was studied frame by frame with every pause, gesture, and movement analyzed. Jaafar reportedly had only about 20 days to prove he could pull it off, making the preparation both a physical and psychological test. The deeper Jaafar went into the preparation, the more the role stopped feeling like ordinary acting. He wasn't simply learning how to perform Billie Jean, he was learning how Michael occupied a stage. And that distinction would become crucial when the cameras finally started rolling, because when the music began, there would be nowhere to hide behind resemblance alone. Why Billie Jean became the hardest performance of the entire movie. Of all the performances Jaafar Jackson had to recreate, Billie Jean presented a problem unlike anything else in the movie. Michael had performed the song thousands of times, but audiences had one particular version permanently burned into their memories, the legendary Motown 25 performance. That meant Jaafar wasn't simply being asked to perform a famous song. He was being asked to recreate one of the most recognizable moments in entertainment history. According to the source, the filmmakers studied the original footage frame by frame, examining the pauses, gestures, footwork, timing, and tiny movements that made Michael's performance so unforgettable. There was almost no room for improvisation. Every detail could be noticed by someone who had watched the original countless times. The physical demands were enormous. According to the source, Jaafar had only a limited period of preparation before filming the sequence, forcing him to repeat the choreography over and over until the movements became automatic. The Motown 25 routine was particularly difficult because Michael's famous movements looked effortless precisely because he had perfected the mechanics behind them. The moonwalk itself was only one part of the challenge. Jaafar had to reproduce Michael's posture, the sudden stops, the controlled gestures, and the way he appeared to transform ordinary movements into something almost weightless. The source describes the preparation as exhausting, with Jaafar continuing even when the physical strain became painful. His feet developed blisters, yet he taped them and returned to rehearsal because the sequence still wasn't finished. But there was another problem that couldn't be solved simply through choreography: the emotion. Michael's Billie Jean performance wasn't memorable only because of what his feet were doing. His pauses created anticipation. His facial expressions changed the atmosphere. Even standing completely still, he appeared to control the entire stage. Jaafar therefore had to learn not only where Michael moved, but when he chose not to move. The source emphasizes that his preparation involved studying the transitions between movements and the small physical habits that audiences might not consciously notice. Those details became essential because copying the famous moonwalk alone would have looked like an imitation, and that was the terrifying part of the challenge. Everyone already knew what Michael's Billie Jean performance looked like. There was nowhere to hide. If Jaafar moved too differently, audiences would notice. If he copied Michael too mechanically, it could feel like a tribute act rather than a movie performance. He had to find the narrow space between exact recreation and believable character acting. The closer filming came, the bigger the question became: could Jaafar reproduce the performance so convincingly that audiences would stop comparing him to Michael and simply experience the moment again? The moment Jaafar finally mastered Michael's iconic moonwalk. The moonwalk may look like one simple illusion, but recreating Michael Jackson's version was anything but simple. For Jaafar Jackson, the challenge wasn't merely sliding backward across a floor. He had to reproduce the exact control, timing, posture, and attitude that made Michael's moonwalk look almost impossible. The Billie Jean sequence was based heavily on Michael's legendary Motown 25 performance, meaning even the smallest difference could be noticed. Jaafar had already spent years studying Michael's movement, but now that knowledge had to become physical instinct. Every step had to look effortless, even though making it look effortless required an enormous amount of work. The preparation became especially demanding because Michael's choreography was built around precision rather than obvious effort. According to the source material, Jaafar repeatedly studied the original performance and practiced the movements until he could reproduce them without consciously thinking about every individual step. He focused on the transitions as much as the famous moves themselves, the way Michael shifted his weight, stopped suddenly, changed direction, and used his upper body while his feet appeared to glide independently underneath him. The moonwalk, therefore, became a test of the entire performance, not just the feet. If Jaafar's shoulders, head, arms, or facial expression were slightly wrong, the illusion could disappear instantly. And then came the physical cost. Jaafar reportedly repeated the routine again and again during rehearsal, eventually pushing himself through painful feet and blisters. Instead of abandoning the sequence, he taped his feet and continued working. That detail reveals just how seriously he approached the recreation. Michael had performed the moonwalk so many times that audiences had come to believe it was effortless. Jaafar had to discover the mechanics behind that illusion and then practice them until the mechanics disappeared from view. The harder he worked, the less the audience was supposed to notice the work. Eventually, something changed. The moonwalk stopped looking like Jaafar performing a difficult dance technique and started looking like Michael Jackson moving across the stage. That was the breakthrough the production needed. Jaafar wasn't simply learning how to slide backward. He was learning how to make the audience believe there was no friction beneath his feet at all. And once that illusion finally clicked, the most famous moment of Billie Jean could move from choreography into something much more powerful: recognition. For the filmmakers, that was the moment the years of preparation began to pay off. For Jaafar, it was proof that he could carry one of Michael's most impossible signatures without relying on nostalgia alone. The reaction that proved. Jaafar had captured Michael's voice. There's a difference between sounding similar to Michael Jackson and making people stop thinking about the difference altogether. That was the reaction Jaafar Jackson ultimately needed. His natural voice already had an unusual resemblance to Michael's, but the production didn't want a superficial imitation. Jaafar had spent years studying Michael's vocal delivery, working on register, tone, breathing, phrasing, and the tiny details that gave Michael's singing its unmistakable character. The result had to survive the most difficult test of all, being heard by people who already knew exactly what Michael sounded like. The response became especially striking when Jaafar performed the musical sequences. His vocals could be blended with Michael's original recordings, allowing the filmmakers to preserve the authentic sound of the songs while Jaafar supplied the live performance. But the source material makes an important distinction. Jaafar wasn't simply mouthing along. In the studio scenes, he performed his own vocals, including the scatting and ad-libs associated with "Don't stop till you get enough." That gave the filmmakers a chance to hear Jaafar's voice without Michael's original vocal carrying the scene. And then came the reaction that mattered most, the reaction from people who had spent their lives around Michael's music. The source describes John Warhurst as recognizing how unusually close Jaafar's voice was to Michael's in both range and sound. Jaafar's preparation had taken that natural resemblance and added control. The correct pitch, vocal attack, vibrato, breathing patterns, and phrasing. Instead of simply trying to sound like Michael, he had learned the mechanics behind the sound. That distinction is what made the performance so convincing. When Jaafar's voice was combined with Michael's original recordings, the transition could become almost invisible. The audience wasn't listening for technical differences anymore. They were watching the movement, hearing the familiar vocal character, and experiencing the emotional memory attached to Billie Jean. For Jaafar, that reaction represented something much bigger than a successful impression. It proved that the years of preparation had worked. He hadn't erased his own identity, and he hadn't literally become Michael. Instead, he had learned Michael's musical language deeply enough to perform it convincingly, and that allowed audiences to experience something they thought they could never hear again. The Billie Jean moment that made everyone forget. They were watching Jaafar. There's a point in every Michael Jackson performance when imitation either works or completely falls apart. With Billie Jean, Jaafar Jackson had to cross that line in front of an audience that already knew exactly what Michael looked like, sounded like, and felt like on stage. The performance wasn't supposed to remind people of Michael every few seconds. It had to create the illusion that the character belonged there naturally. After years of studying Michael's movements, voice, posture, and timing, Jaafar finally had the opportunity to put everything together in one sequence. The most important ingredient was restraint. Michael's famous Motown 25 performance wasn't built entirely around huge dance moves. Some of its most memorable moments came from the pauses, the way he would stand still, hold a position, let the music breathe, and then suddenly explode into movement. Jaafar had studied those details carefully. The moonwalk, the hat, the microphone, the body angle, the pauses between movements. Each piece had to arrive at precisely the right moment. The source material describes the original performance being studied frame by frame, making the recreation less like ordinary choreography and more like reconstructing a piece of performance history. Then the music took over. Jaafar moved through the routine while his performance vocals were incorporated into the production, allowing the physical resemblance and vocal resemblance to work together. Suddenly, the individual details stopped feeling like separate tricks. The voice sounded familiar. The posture looked familiar. The timing felt familiar. And when Jaafar reached the iconic moments of the routine, the audience didn't need an explanation of what they were seeing. They recognized it instinctively. That is what made the Billie Jean sequence so powerful. Jaafar didn't need to literally become Michael Jackson for the illusion to work. He needed to recreate enough of Michael's artistic language that viewers could temporarily stop thinking about the actor underneath the costume. The years of rehearsal, vocal training, and obsessive study had all been leading toward this one objective, making the performance feel lived rather than copied. And for a moment, that distinction became almost impossible to see. Jaafar was still Jaafar, but the stage presence, the movement, the voice, and the unmistakable choreography created a version of Michael that audiences had been waiting to see. The voice behind Billie Jean that shocked everyone on set. The moonwalk was only half of the problem. Jaafar Jackson also had to sound convincing while performing one of Michael Jackson's most recognizable songs. Billie Jean is not forgiving vocally. Michael's delivery depends on a very specific combination of tone, phrasing, breath control, and restrained emotion. Jaafar's natural voice was already remarkably close to Michael's, but it sat lower, so he had to learn how to bring it into the higher register associated with his uncle. According to the source material, music supervisor John Warhurst worked with Jaafar on finding the right pitch and tone rather than simply forcing him to imitate Michael. The preparation went far beyond singing the melody correctly. Jaafar reportedly spent years studying Michael's performances and practicing the small details of his vocal delivery. The source describes work on breathing, phrasing, vibrato, and the way Michael attacked individual sounds. That mattered because audiences don't recognize Michael only by the notes he sang. They recognize the spaces between the notes, the sudden changes in intensity, the soft beginnings, and the way his voice could move from almost conversational to explosive within seconds. Jaafar had to reproduce that musical language, while still making the performance believable as his own physical performance on camera. Then came the moment when the production could finally hear the result. During the filmed musical sequences, Jaafar performed into the microphone while his vocals were blended with Michael's original recordings. That approach allowed the production to preserve the authenticity of Michael's original sound while giving Jaafar's performance its own energy. But according to the source material, Jaafar also demonstrated that he could carry vocal material himself. In the studio scenes, he sang without Michael's voice underneath him, including the scatting and ad-libs associated with "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough." That distinction is important because it explains why people on set were reportedly surprised. The illusion wasn't being created simply by playing Michael's original recording over Jaafar's performance. Jaafar had actually spent years developing the technical ability to reproduce the sound and manner of Michael's delivery. When the microphone was finally in front of him, all that preparation had to come together at once. The correct pitch, the breathing, the phrasing, the movement, and the emotion. And suddenly, Billie Jean sounded different. Not because Michael's voice had been recreated, but because Jaafar had learned how to make his own voice move through the song in a way that reminded everyone exactly who they were watching. The moment Jaafar's voice became almost impossible to tell apart from Michael's. The most unsettling part of Jaafar Jackson's transformation wasn't seeing him move like Michael. It was hearing him. His natural voice already carried a striking resemblance to Michael's, but the production knew that resemblance alone wouldn't be enough. Jaafar had to learn how to control the higher register, tone, phrasing, and vocal character that audiences immediately associate with his uncle. According to the source material, music supervisor John Warhurst worked with Jaafar on finding the right pitch, rather than forcing an artificial imitation. The objective was to make the similarity feel natural, something coming from Jaafar, rather than something pasted onto him. That distinction became especially important once Jaafar began recording. The source explains that he wasn't simply relying on Michael's original vocals for every musical scene. In the studio sequences, Jaafar performed vocals himself, including the scatting and ad-libs heard during "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough." Those recordings gave the filmmakers a chance to hear what Jaafar could actually do without Michael's voice carrying the performance. And because Jaafar had already spent years studying Michael's breathing, vibrato, phrasing, and vocal attacks, the result reportedly came remarkably close to the sound the filmmakers were trying to recreate. But the real illusion happened when voice and movement came together. During the performance sequences, Jaafar sang live while his vocals were blended with Michael's original recordings. That created a fascinating effect. The audience could hear Michael's original musical identity while watching Jaafar physically perform the song. The more closely Jaafar matched the timing, gestures, breathing, and vocal delivery, the harder it became to separate the two performers in the finished moment. What had started as technical preparation suddenly became something emotional. Viewers weren't analyzing every vocal layer. They were simply experiencing the familiar sound and image of Michael Jackson again. And that's why Jaafar's voice became such an important part of the transformation. He didn't need to literally become Michael's voice. He needed to understand it deeply enough that his own performance could occupy the same musical space. The years of repetition had taught him how Michael shaped words, controlled his breath, used vibrato, and moved between softness and intensity. Once those techniques became instinctive, the difference between Jaafar performing Michael and Michael performing became much harder for the audience to feel. For Jaafar, that was the ultimate breakthrough. The voice that once had to be trained and consciously controlled could finally operate almost automatically. And when that happened alongside the moonwalk, the costume, the lighting, and the choreography, the illusion became far more powerful than any one element could create alone. The performance that finally proved Jaafar was more than Michael's nephew. For years, the easiest way to describe Jaafar Jackson was simply Michael Jackson's nephew. But that description could only take him so far. Being related to Michael explained the resemblance, the musical background, and perhaps even some of the natural vocal similarities. It did not explain whether Jaafar could actually perform at the level required to portray one of the most recognizable entertainers in history. That question was ultimately answered not by his surname, but by what happened when he stepped onto the stage and performed. The Billie Jean sequence became the clearest test because almost everything about Michael's Motown 25 performance was already legendary. Jaafar had to reproduce the choreography, timing, posture, and vocal delivery while avoiding the trap of looking like someone doing a Michael Jackson tribute. According to the source material, he spent years studying Michael's performances and then went through an intense rehearsal process, repeating the movements until they became instinctive. Even when the physical work became painful, he continued rehearsing. The objective was not simply to remember the choreography, it was to understand the performance well enough that it could come naturally. And that is where Jaafar began separating himself from the label of Michael's nephew. The more he performed, the less important the family connection became. His voice had to work, his movement had to work, his timing had to work, and most importantly, the emotional feeling behind the performance had to work. The source material describes his natural vocal similarity to Michael, but also emphasizes the training required to develop that similarity into a controlled performance. In the studio, Jaafar could even perform vocals without Michael's original voice underneath him, demonstrating that the resemblance wasn't simply being created by playback. That changed the meaning of the role. Jaafar wasn't being asked to prove that he was Michael Jackson's equal. Nobody could realistically replace Michael. He was proving something different, that he was capable of becoming a performer in his own right, while carrying the responsibility of portraying Michael. And perhaps that's why the Billie Jean performance became so important. It showed that Jaafar's connection to Michael wasn't the destination, it was the starting point. The family resemblance might have opened the door, but the years of training, discipline, rehearsal, and performance were what allowed him to walk through it. By the time Jaafar finished the routine, the question was no longer whether Michael's nephew could play Michael. The question had become what Jaafar Jackson could do after proving he could. The legacy Jaafar created by stepping into Michael's shoes. When Jaafar Jackson first stepped into Michael Jackson's shoes, the expectation was almost impossible to satisfy. He wasn't just portraying a famous musician, he was portraying someone whose voice, movement, and stage presence had become part of global culture. And yet, after years of preparation, Jaafar reached a point where the conversation began to change. People weren't only asking whether he looked like Michael anymore, they were asking whether he could make audiences feel something when they watched him perform. That became the real legacy of the transformation. Jaafar studied Michael's performances so intensely that the smallest details became part of his preparation. His posture, breathing, vocal delivery, pauses, choreography, and the transitions between movements. But the goal was never simply to reproduce Michael mechanically. The source material repeatedly emphasizes the importance of understanding the performance from the inside, why Michael moved a certain way, why he paused, how he controlled the audience, and how he used his voice as another instrument. And that's what makes the Billie Jean performance more significant than a simple recreation. It became a bridge between two generations. Michael's original performance represented an era that changed popular music and dance forever. Jaafar's version allowed a new audience to encounter those moments through someone who had grown up close to the man behind them. He wasn't replacing Michael. He was carrying the memory of that artistry into a completely different moment. But there was another lesson in Jaafar's journey. His greatest advantage wasn't simply having Michael Jackson's blood running through his veins. That may have given him a natural connection, but it couldn't teach him the discipline required to reproduce Michael's performances. The years of rehearsal, vocal training, physical preparation, and repeated failure were what transformed that connection into something audiences could actually see and hear. So, when Jaafar finally stepped away from the stage after performing Billie Jean, he had accomplished something much bigger than copying one of Michael's most famous routines. He had shown that Michael's legacy could inspire another performer without being duplicated by him. Jaafar could never be Michael Jackson, and he didn't need to be. His challenge was to honor the original while finding his own place inside the story. And perhaps that is the most important thing he carried forward. Not Michael's identity, but Michael's dedication to becoming unforgettable. End of documentary. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more rare Michael Jackson stories, behind-the-scenes discoveries, and untold moments from music history. Until next time, thank you for watching.